How best to monitor the pulse of Latin America? Retired U.S. Ambassador Miles Frechette knows the answer. He'll discuss it next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Exploring the intricacies of Latin American politics is like breathing for retired U.S. Ambassador Miles Frechette. A familiar figure in capitals across the region, he is also the person to call when an important issue breaks. Welcome to the show, Miles.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Let's step back and give a sort of broad perspective about what's happening in Latin America today. What is good, what is bad?
Okay, what is bad is the fact that China, the demand in China and Asia for commodities is down. That means a lot of countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru are going to be selling less. So the GDP is going to take a hit. What is good is that there is a growing sense that more democracy is needed. All the polls suggest that people are concerned about the state of democracy in the region. Now, what does that mean? It means in some cases that the people, not that their leaders are very democratic, but that their leaders talk to them a lot. And that's an important thing. But those are two issues right then. And some of the countries are not going to do so badly. All of those countries that do most of their trade with the United States, like Central America, the Caribbean, they're going up because our economy is going up. So there you are.
And longer term, the economy seems to be on a pretty solid course for the region. So prospects for growth in the coming year are probably pretty good.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a number of studies that suggest that next year it's going to be better. It's not going to be fantastic, but there are going to be some countries like Panama and Bolivia, believe it or not, that are going to be growing still at the rate of 5 to 6%, which is extraordinary.
It's a rate we'd like to have in this country.
It would be great.
Despite the economic issues, people seem to be happy. There was a recent happiness poll that was issued that said the top 10 countries, 9 of them, I believe, were in Latin America. Does that surprise you, or is this consistent with what you know?
No, it doesn't, because in many of those countries, the sense of being happy is part of the culture. It shows that you're doing better. After all, there is more prosperity. I was just in Peru for a couple of weeks, and let me tell you, over the years I've been to Peru about once every 2 years, back to 1968, and the prosperity you see in Peru, despite the fact that its income from China has gone down, is extraordinary.
What else contributes to happiness? Are people secure in their religion? For example, we see these reports about Catholicism receding, which seems at least a bit ironic in light of the current Pope. Is this something that has been happening for a while?
It's been happening for a long time. Back as early as the 1970s in Brazil, particularly, the number of Protestants was growing, and the number of Protestants is still growing in Brazil. Part of the reason is that the Roman Catholic Church has few vocations. They don't have enough priests. And the Protestant groups, their pastors tend to live with the population they serve. And so people feel more of a kinship with them. But let me tell you something. The fact that the Pope is from Latin America is going to make him a big hit wherever he goes. They're going to love it. Doesn't matter that he's Argentine, and Brazilians sometimes wonder about Argentina. No, he's a South American. Boy, that's important.
That's important. When we talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, at least from a U.S. Washington perspective, we tend to focus on certain issue areas. Trade is one of them, so is immigration, so is the illegal narcotics question. Tell us where you see those 3 areas going as far as political issues, starting with trade.
Well, with trade, we've got a lot of good news. You've got Mexico, Chile, Peru, that are engaged, Mexico too, that are in Colombia, that are engaged in the Alliance for the Pacific. That is to grow more ties to trade with Asia. That's very important. Also, both Chile and Peru are negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're going to be a part of that. And for Latin America, even though there is some trade between the different groups in Latin America, there is no, in a globalizing world, there is nothing that can beat doing business around the globe. And you know, there are people like Brazil, for example, who doesn't really like free trade agreements. They've been trying for 15 years to get a free trade agreement with Europe. They understand that their continent alone is not going to make for greater prosperity. And with prosperity comes greater security, better education, better fulfillment for the population. People worry about two things: crime, which is high. The rate of murder in some countries in Latin America is the highest in the world, Honduras, for example. And they worry about democracy in the sense that the old political parties are all sort of vanishing, except in Peru and Uruguay and Chile. And they're being replaced by electoral vehicles, just groups of people that elect somebody. And in some countries, the people accept a president being reelected consecutively 3 or even 4 times. Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. These are, you know, these are things that people worry about because they recognize, believe it or not, ordinary people recognize that staying too long in office leads to getting used to a certain way of doing things, abuse of power. Alternation is something that they feel instinctively is not a bad idea.
How has trade developed between the United States and Latin America? I'm thinking back to NAFTA and some of the other big trade agreements. Did those produce what they promised?
Yeah, for the NAFTA, certainly. You can go to Mexico and people will say this isn't right and that isn't right. But in fact, you know, Mexico has grown. Trade between Mexico and the United States is huge. So it's a big success. The trade agreements with what they call the CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Area, and the DR, is doing less. But quite frankly, I think that the countries of the region have to think more about how they sell themselves. There's altogether too much in the region of saying, well, we've always sold coffee or always sold potatoes, and we want to continue. But that's not the way it works. And also, I'm very hopeful that the countries of the region will begin to establish agreements with countries in Asia, because that's the future. Now, some do. Peru and Chile, for example, and Colombia have free trade agreements with China, with Korea. So they're getting the idea, but it's a spreading sort of a thing. But there's a sense, everybody understands that a lot more can be done, but they're going to have to change the way they go about it.
Let's switch to another topic. Immigration is a big issue for people in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a big issue for the United States. We've had some false starts with compromise legislation that would have changed the immigration situation, and now we've had a recent initiative by the president to try to instill some change in that subject area.
Sure.
Where are you on the immigration issue? Are we moving in the right direction or not?
I think so. I think that the president's action, unilateral though it may be, and although some people say it's going to be very complicated because a lot of these things take a lot of judicial inquiry, et cetera, I think it's good because it forces the issue. And I think then both parties are going to have to face this. Let's face it, we need immigrants. We always have, we always will. Right now, our birth rate is going down. We're getting more old people. We need young people in the workforce, and Latin Americans with proper education can do that. So I'm hoping that we do some big reforms in immigration. It won't come right away, but it's good for this country. Those people who think that those people are taking jobs away from it are just plain mistaken. This country needs fresh labor force.
If you were making the decision, what would be your top priority or two in the immigration area?
Well, I would, first of all, regularize the presence of all these people. they're here, they're contributing, they have children. The president's addressing as much as he can unilaterally, but the law has got to take this into account and make provision for immigrant visas for people who can come up here and help us out. Not only that, but the demographic in the United States is changing. Stuff that used to be in the East and the Middle West is now shifting to the South, to the Southwest. Guess who fits into the Southwest? People who speak Spanish. Come on. And that's where they're going largely anyway, although you'll find them pretty much all over the United States. Mm-hmm. So, it's, I'm glad the dam appears to have been broken. Everybody's a little upset, but it's something that needs to be done. And the idea, and here I'm going to say something that may sound political, but it's not meant to be. The idea that the first thing we have to do is fortify the border before we can talk about immigration is just nonsense. It's a stalling tactic. And, we should have a better sense of where this country is going. Maybe as some of the older people in Congress leave and younger people enter Congress, there will be fresh thinking about why young people in the labor force are important, including people contributing to Social Security.
That's what we won't get into Social Security, but that's definitely a hot topic. Let's talk about another hot topic, the whole illegal narcotics matter. As U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, you were up to your neck in this for years, and you certainly understand the issue as well as anyone and better than most. What do you think is happening on the illegal narcotics front that is positive and what is not positive?
What is positive is that the United States is absolutely serious about helping Central America and the Caribbean. Last year, they devoted about $150 million to it. This year, the administration has asked for $300 million. We're going to make big efforts. We have to increase law enforcement in that part of the world too. Those countries are simply too small, too weak to be able to deal with the crushing power of the money that comes from narco trafficking. And I am delighted that the administration is taking this more seriously. Now, what's negative? A lot of people say, this American-style fighting of narcotics isn't going to do it. What we have to do is legalize it. Of course, that, frankly, isn't true either. That's a simplistic approach. But different approaches, like taking a more medical view of things, is a good way to begin. The other thing to remember is narcotics is a global phenomenon. You're not going to deal with it in country X and think that's going to be taken care of. You've got to work at this around the world. Latin America isn't the only place with huge drug problems. Iraq, the Far East. But it's slow changing. People, even in this country, people are realizing that some of the sentencing we had for people with who did crack cocaine versus powder cocaine was not right, and that some of the sentences we had for people who were caught with very small amounts really was a burden. I mean, we have more people in prisons in the United States than any other country in the world. That's federal, state, local. And all over the place, states and the federal government are saying, we've got to reduce the cost of this. This is killing us. And it's true. So we have to take smarter approaches to this. It's not going to please people. And we have to find a kinder, gentler, more medical approach to this, or you're going to have people continuing with wretched lives. That's a waste of good human talent. It's a shame.
You referenced the overwhelming influence of drug cartels and how this is, yes, an economic matter, it's a criminal matter, it's a social matter, and the violence that accompanies it, both on the source side and on the consumption side.
Absolutely.
What can we do about that violence? It seems to be, in some places, especially along the U.S.-Mexico border, to be out of control.
Let me put it to you this way. You have to establish a greater hold of law and order. You have to train policemen better. You have to pay them better. One of the problems in Central America and in South America is that in many countries, this isn't the case in Colombia or in Chile, but the policeman's pay is pretty meager. And so it doesn't take much money to buy somebody like that. But that's the first step. Then you have to create special units that are vetted, that go after the people who are perpetrating the violence. But we're not going to get away from this until we come up with, over time, a new proposal. But these countries in Central America and the Caribbean just simply cannot do it without our help.
Tell us about how the evolution of the political system affects everything that we're talking about. At one point in history, so much of Latin America was under authoritarian rule. And then we applauded the dawn of democracy, and then we had issues with systems that were socialist and so forth. And now we have a return to socialism in many places.
Well, number one, there are a lot of leftist governments in Latin America, but they are not all of the same stripe. Obviously, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador are always insulting the United States and laughing at the United States. Brazil, that doesn't share our views on many things, in fact, does cooperate with the United States. The same goes for Chile. Uruguay is another country that doesn't agree with the United States in everything, but they happen to get along. So to say that Latin America is all leftist is simply not true. But you're right to point out that it wasn't too long ago, the 1980s, that there were still a fair number of dictatorships in this country. And since World War II, a huge number of dictatorships existed in Latin America. But a very curious thing happened. The debt crisis of the 1980s hit Latin America, and guess what? After, per capita GDP went down 9% over that decade, what happened? The countries came out of it. They got help from the International Monetary Fund, from the US government, and from the banks. And the dictatorships disappeared, with the exception of Cuba, which was then and still is the only dictatorship in the region. So that debt crisis led to the acceptance of more orthodox economic policies in Latin America and to these democracies. Now, however, when the democracies were getting cranked up again in Latin America, everybody thought one term was fine for a president. But with the passage of time, more and more countries now accept 2 consecutive terms, Brazil being one, Colombia being another. And I think people are worried about that, and I worry about it because when people stay in power too long, I think one term is just fine. When they stay in power too long, I think there's abuse of power. People get used to thinking that they have some sort of an entitlement. And don't forget, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and Ecuador, you can be reelected consecutively 3 and even 4 times. So, and I think this is one of the concerns that people have, What does this man represent? Is it just a group of guys who are saying, I'm going to bring a better economy of this country, or is there some sort of founding principles? Because along with all of this are abuses of human rights. More journalists are being killed than ever before. Mexico, Colombia, some of the countries, even Brazil, are passing laws that restrict what newsmen can report on. This is very, very bad. I mean, the idea that a president who was elected by the people should want to shield himself either legally or through, or as in some countries, for example, where the president, again, I'll mention the starring 3, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, those leaders dominate all 3 of the powers of the democracy. They dominate the National Assembly or the Congress, they dominate the judicial. That's not a democracy. And so it is worrisome. But what I take hope from is the fact that people seem to have almost an inchoate sense that it isn't going right that way and that we have to return to something else. In Colombia, for example, they added a second term about 10 years ago. Now the present president is saying that's not a good idea. Let's cut it back to 1. I think this is very useful.
How does U.S. influence play in all of this? There was one time in history when the United States was the model democracy for Latin America, the Caribbean, other parts of the world. And now with the deadlock in Washington, there's not a whole lot to emulate. How is the U.S. Latin American relationship currently? What are we not doing that we should be doing?
The United States has a special responsibility to the region to talk about democracy and human rights. We should not be afraid to do that. We are helping in a variety of ways, education, exchanges, all of that, because there is a sense, both in Latin America and here, that with better education, those countries can progress. And of course, if we can enter into trade agreements, they'll have the money to carry these things out. But it's, frankly, I just don't think the administration has been very imaginative in dealing with this. Now, granted, a lot of problems, Iraq, Syria, Libya, in Africa, Boko Haram and all of that. Nevertheless, you know, Latin America was born, or the Western Hemisphere became interested in democracy at about the right time when they wanted to get away, get their independence from Europe. And I think that we should not forget that. We should continue to stress these things and the importance of human rights and the importance of a free press. Sometimes people don't like to hear it. Well, that's too bad. And let me tell you one other thing about Latin America. Despite all the dysfunction in Congress, people in Latin America recognize, A, that this is a very powerful economy, B, that institutions are strong. They may not work that well, but the institutions are strong, and that the United States works. I mean, there is no better indication of this than by the number of tourists who flood the United States from Latin America and the purchasing of property in the United States. Why? Because their property is safer in the United States. This is not just multi-billionaires buying huge things. These are people, you know, upper middle class, buying property in the United States because they know it's going to be protected, whereas in their own country, maybe not.
Latin America and the Caribbean at various times are at the top of the priority list for the United States. Usually it's in response to something that has happened, a change of government, a crisis of some kind. What should we do routinely in dealing with Latin America? Or to put it differently, if you were in charge and you wanted to usher in a new era of U.S.-Latin American relations, what would be the top 2 or 3 decisions you would make?
You mean for the whole region or Caribbean alone?
For the whole region.
Well,
Let's assume you're president.
Yeah, well, I think that we should be more ambitious, more imaginative. We should be stressing continually that we're interested in helping them trade more with the entire world. We should be talking more about democracy and strong institutions. Institutions in Latin America are very strong in some countries, some of them like Brazil or Chile, very strong. But in others, they are not. They're pretty much, look at Peru, for example. Mr. Fujimori was elected president, then he became virtually a dictator. Argentina, the state of democracy in Argentina is a little parlous. But that's what we should be doing. In other words, this is not, everybody in Latin America says, how about a big Marshall Plan for us? Give us money and we'll do good things. We don't have it. We have other priorities. And besides, I think the experience of many years is that really doesn't work. If the countries don't buy into these things and start working on it, and we can give them, how shall we say, the experience of the United States rather than always the money. Let them make the money from trade and apply it. If they don't believe in these things, they're not going to happen.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Ambassador Miles Frechette.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.